and go. Thank you, Aaron, for
Mm-hmm.
remembering to do that. So our people who couldn't make it can join us. But anyway, we don't want to, without further ado, I think maybe we can just jump into our program. We'll do some quick introductions in case people don't know everybody. So I'm Troy Moon. I'm the Sustainability Director today, and we're joined by Aaron Farrell from my office and Christine Cormando, our Planning Director. Do you want? Maybe you want to introduce yourselves, folks, or Christine?
Yeah. So Christine is here. She's the director of the Planning and Urban Development Department. I'll just run through us quickly, so that way we're getting moving. And I'm Nell Donaldson. I'm the director of special projects in the Planning Department, and I'm joined by Matt Grooms, who's a senior planner in our department. And this is the essence of the ReCode team from planning, although we've been using staff all up and down the department. It's an all hands on deck effort. Thank you so much for having us here to talk about ReCode. We were here with sort of one climate future themed presentation in the summer, but a lot has happened since then. So it's good timing for us to be back. We are really right now trying to drum up as many folks as we can to get engaged with the ReCode work, because we've recently released the first sort of major work product of what we called phase 2 of ReCode. And so we are looking for feedback from people right now. So this is, again, really well timed. So thanks for having us. I am going to talk just really briefly about what ReCode is, and then I'm going to pass it over to Matt to talk about sort of climate-related goals out of the first major work product of ReCode phase 2. And so, without further ado, hopefully you can see that. The presentation, everybody? Yep. Okay, good. Here we go. And then there will be time at the end for questions and comments. So we're really looking forward to that part of this presentation as well. So ReCode, for those of you who don't know, is really at its essence an effort of trying to connect the dots between our policy goals as represented in our planning work at the city of Portland and our technical regulations on the ground, in this case, our land use code. And I'll talk a little bit about what the land use code is in a second. Here's another way of looking at this. At the sort of top and guiding the city's work, sort of citywide, is our comprehensive plan. That's what you see is labeled there as Portland's vision. A comprehensive plan is required by state statute in Maine, and it includes broad policy statements and goals and recommendations around things like the environment and the waterfront and our economy and historic resources and housing and lots of things that are central to a well-functioning city. So below the umbrella of the comprehensive plan, we have neighborhood and topic area plans. Here we show One Climate Future as a great example of a plan that sort of takes a nugget from the comprehensive plan and extends it further out, further develops recommendations and strategies to make sure that the city is doing what we need to do around one sort of big goal around climate and sustainability. Below that, sort of on the ground and implementing the sort of goals and recommendations of that planning work, we have our regulations. Again, in this code, in this case, our land use code is what we'll really be talking about today. But the land use code sort of creates the on-the-ground environment in which things happen, in which people can build, in which people can develop any sort of use on their property, in which investments are made. And so it really is sort of the implementing sort of mechanism for all of that policy work above it. Just to step into the code for a second, the land use code, and we'll call it, I call it the code because it's the code that we in our office work with mostly, but obviously the city has a code that is much bigger than just the land use code. The land use code has existed. We've had a land use code in the city of Portland for almost a century. And ultimately the land use code is a way of sort of organizing how land in the city is used and built upon to make sure that we're meeting our collective long-term goals as a city. So the code includes a text element, which you sort of see a sample of on the left, and a map element, which you see a sample of on the right. The text of the land use code includes includes standards related to all kinds of things. Standards related to what types of uses you can have on a property, how you can build a property out in terms of how high a building can be, how close to a property line a building can be. The land use code also includes, the text includes standards related to historic preservation and related to signs and parking. Includes rules about how development is reviewed in the city. It also includes rules about how what we can do in shoreland, areas near the shore or in floodplain. And all of those those text-based rules are accompanied by the map on the right that sort of shows what rules apply in what parts of the city. So our most recent, and I'll get back to the code in a second, our most recent comprehensive plan was adopted in 2017, and it was developed with a lot of public input, and again, laid out a number of broad policy goals for the city across a variety of dimensions. One of the first recommendations of the comprehensive plan, Portland's plan, was that we rework our land use code. At the time, our land use code was very long. It was about 1,000 pages in length. It contained a lot of redundancy. It could be confusing to navigate. It could be confusing to administer. And so Portland's plan, our comprehensive plan, acknowledged or recommended that we rework the code first on an organizational level to make sure that it worked better for people across the city. And second, Portland's plan recommended reworking the land use code at sort of a more fundamental level, just to make sure that the code is really doing the work we want it to in terms of advancing our goals as a city. Out of this recommendation was born the ReCode process. ReCode, we've broken into 2 phases. The first phase was, which was completed in November of 2020, was about the sort of first goal out of Portland's plan, the organizational sort of restructuring of our land use code to make sure that it's easier to navigate and easier to administer. There was some policy work that was done in phase 1 of ReCode. We did some work on parking regulations, for instance. The accessory dwelling unit provisions of the code were simplified and restructured. We also passed an impact fee ordinance under phase 1. So there was some policy work, but by and large, phase 1 was the organizational exercise. We finished phase 1 in November of 2020, and we've now stepped into what we call phase 2. And phase 2 is really focused around the meatier work again of making sure that the land use regulations on the ground, our zones, our dimensional standards, our use standards are actually getting us where we want to be as we've articulated it in our comprehensive plan. The first work product of phase 2, I alluded to this at the beginning, we've just released, and Matt's going to give you a little rundown on some of the recommendations out of this first work product. We've called it a code evaluation. It's really like this technical analysis of, again, how our code is really meeting the goals of the comprehensive plan. So we've engaged a consultant, and what we've done is look through the comprehensive plan in detail, look through plans that have come after the comprehensive plan, like One Climate Future, that sort of expand on the goals of the comprehensive plan and really get into the heart of our land use code, our zoning, our zones, our residential zone structure, our mixed use zone structure, our regulations around shoreland, all kinds of these things, and try to determine how well, again, our regulations are actually helping us achieve the goals of the comprehensive plan, identifying where there are weaknesses and opportunities, and identifying some preliminary recommendations on things in the code that will need to change if we want to go where we've said we want to go in our comprehensive plan. So what does the code evaluation recommend with respect to climate, which this group is really interested in? Matt's going to give us a quick rundown on what the code evaluation says around climate. Matt.
Thanks, Nell.
Yep.
So before I jump in on this, I just wanted to say, so if you haven't had a chance to take a look at the code evaluation, I'd strongly recommend it. So today we're going to be talking about those recommendations that come out of the code evaluation that are specific to climate. As you'll see as we go through this, there's a lot of kind of tangential topic areas that really do, as we are all well aware of, have some impact on climate, but there's a whole host of other recommendations in there that are really relevant to our everyday life here in the city of Portland. It's a fairly easy document to get through. It's fairly concise and straightforward. So again, I'd certainly recommend taking a look at that document. It's on the ReCode Portland website if you haven't had a chance to. But so if you could go to the next slide now. So we've grouped this. Starting off, there's a couple of these recommendations that came out of the code evaluation that we're kind of calling low-hanging fruit. It's ones on this slide, but then a couple of the next slides that are perhaps not as substantive as some of the recommendations that we're weighing that may involve some kind of minor cleanup or just we kind of envision as being easier to implement in the long run. So for example, this includes some cleanup to our rules around installation of solar, cutting out some of the processing or administrative processes around approving and developing new solar across the city. The second one there is, again, to clean up our definition of agriculture, which is in many ways outdated at this point, does not take into account some of the modern practices around agriculture and aquaculture that exist currently, and that, especially, for example, with respect to like urban agriculture, which may occupy a much smaller footprint, which may be well suited to many areas across the city, though is currently prohibited, given the fact that agriculture is treated as this much more intensive principal use. And then this third item here, to carve out flexibilities for eco-innovation. We understand that building practices are changing as new sustainability rules and regulations are put into place. We now have, we're now promoting passive house development and other kind of sustainable development tools and patterns across the city. And we want to make sure that our dimensional standards, that our design standards, for example, are taking into account how, say, for example, building footprints or massing and scale of buildings is changing as we start to see more and more of that type of development. Another element here is to overhaul our landscaping and natural resources protection. First, as we have identified previously, our landscaping rules are largely focused around buffering of development and the aesthetic that landscaping can provide. And what the code evaluation calls out is instead to really reprioritize what aims we're seeking to achieve with landscaping. So, for example, increasing the amount of native species that are included in new development projects, ensuring that there is a sufficiently robust tree canopy to provide relief from the urban heat island effect, increasing the amount of edible plantings that are recommended in new development. And then also recognizing that landscaping has a really important stormwater function as well as an aesthetic function. And then this last item here is to update and strengthen protections for wetlands, urban impaired streams, critical ecosystems, and coastal resources. And one of those actually being an update to the city's shoreline zoning requirements, which is required per state statute, and which we are currently, we have not done based around the most recent changes to that state statute. So that's something that is also recommended in this code evaluation. This next one is to encourage sustainable construction patterns. So we actually have rules in place currently for affordable housing development. We, under certain circumstances, permit developers of new affordable housing to build buildings that are taller or to provide more units per acre or per site with respect to market rate units, or to reduce the required setbacks, so the distance between the edge of the building and the property line, where new affordable housing is being developed. We would look to mirror those standards as well for new development that achieves some of our city's environmental goals. So for example, this could be where development is LEED certified or built to passive house standards, or where there is where the development is anticipated to have net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And then this next item here is looking at coastal resiliency. And this is something that's called out as requiring further study and further evaluation as part of this code evaluation. We understand that right now there's a lot of existing development that occurs in areas that are flood prone, and that those areas will continue to see more and more flooding as sea levels rise. And so we note that this is an area of critical importance. But we do also want to acknowledge that we need to better understand what types of development are well suited to exist in those locations. What types of regulatory changes do we need to take into account that would better enable new development in flood-prone locations to be successful, to be viable, to not be damaged or destroyed as in areas of frequent flooding. And then also to better understand where we should prioritize development away from those flood-prone areas. So if you look at the next slide, this is actually a map that was produced as part of One Climate Future that shows kind of the intensity of those flood-prone areas and where this is expected or projected to go in the coming years as we see more and more of these flood events occur across the city. And so these are the areas that we would specifically be looking at as part of that future research work, which would be kind of an early initiative as part of this phase 2 work. And then of course, we're all well aware that there's this close connection between our transportation systems and their environmental impact. We know that driving gasoline-powered vehicles and single occupancy vehicles is not good for the environment. This is something that is, we historically have not responded to that, to that thought. Parking policy previously and transportation policy has always been around making sure that our transportation systems are operating efficiently with, minimal delays, that there's more than enough parking to meet parking demand, even at peak times. And we're starting to really recalibrate how we look at our transportation systems. We know that there's a finite amount of space. We know that there will be continued demand for those transportation systems going forward. And so really the thinking now is how can we reduce the overall amount of new vehicle trips that are being generated? This can be achieved through a number of different means. One of those is really to cap the parking supply, making sure that parking is really well calibrated to each individual demand and each individual need, and that there's not an excess of parking that makes it easier and easier to use an automobile. The second is really requiring kind of putting the onus back on individual developers to think critically about how they themselves can reduce their overall trip generation and parking demand. And that is through a tool called Transportation Demand Management. It's something that exists currently, and we're looking to make that more robust as we go forward to really more aggressively cut back on the travel that is occurring. And all of that being said, I think we acknowledge that cars are likely here to stay for the foreseeable future. And so this third element here is instead of promoting gasoline-powered vehicles, really make conscientious efforts to help the transition to electric vehicles happen. So updating electric vehicle standards as they come out. Obviously, this is an emerging technology, and so it's something that we've included as part of this code evaluation to kind of continually monitor and study to understand whether or not the practices that were introduced as part of ReCode Phase 1 should be updated going forward with respect to new EV charging. And then this is a graphic actually that was produced as part of ReCode Phase 1. Obviously, we've been doing this kind of work for a while now, where we have been looking to really cut back on parking that is being provided as part of new development. One of the exemptions that was written into ReCode Phase 1 was for new development occurring within a quarter mile of fixed public transit. So this map is showing all of the areas across the city that are within that buffer around public transit, and all new development occurring in those locations would be exempt from providing off-street parking. So this next element here is around housing. This obviously has been a this has been very loud and very, I think we've all heard a lot recently about the housing crisis that is occurring in our city. We note that there is there's a perceived lack of affordable housing across the city, that there are not enough variety in types of housing across the city. And one thing is, as you may well be aware, as you look to different neighborhoods across the city, and particularly in areas off peninsula, you'll see a really diverse range of housing. You'll see single family housing, of course, but then also 2, 3, and 4 family housing interspersed within those neighborhoods. And that really reflects the kind of historical development patterns for a lot of Portland. Current zoning does not permit, especially in areas off peninsula, or in most areas off peninsula, does not permit what we consider this missing middle housing. So again, 2, 3, and 4 unit development that typically is considered contextual with single family development. Those types of development are generally not permitted within those zones. And so that's something that we would be looking to reintroduce back into our zoning vocabulary and back into our zoning framework for those off peninsula locations. And so we'll run through a couple of slides here going forward that show just what the existing condition is. So this first map is showing areas of the city where multifamily development, and it's worth taking a step back there to clarify that our kind of conception of missing middle is that 2, 3, and 4 unit development. 2 unit development is permitted under certain circumstances in the R5. Our threshold for multifamily development, as we define it in the code, is 3 units and up. So these are areas of the city that permit by right, so there's no conditional use requirements associated with them, permit development of 3 units or more. So you can see here, most of the peninsula is included in that. So that includes a number of our business zones, as well as the R6 zone, which is our highest density residential zone. And then in areas off peninsula, again, you have kind of a smattering of different neighborhood business, local business zones that exists along our prominent nodes and corridors that do permit higher density housing and housing or multifamily housing. And then this next slide. So this slide shows that while only 10.2% of the land area within the city is zoned in such a way that would allow for multifamily housing, an additional 31% is zoned in a way that would allow multifamily housing to occur as a conditional use. And I'll caveat that by saying that the rules around multifamily housing in most of those off peninsula locations are really restrictive and somewhat misleading. For example, in the R3 and the R5 zones, which constitute the vast majority of that area that has now since been added into this graphic, multifamily is only permitted where we are looking at the adaptive reuse of an existing institutional building, such as like a school or a library or a church. In those instances, there are rules that would allow those buildings to be redeveloped as housing. There are also restrictive rules around development of what we call planned residential unit developments. So these are, kind of your more typical garden style apartment complex that are required to have substantial land area before they can be developed. And there are actually very few existing sites around the city in those zones that are still available for development that would be eligible to make use of that. So while it appears that a lot of Portland is zoned to allow for some form of multifamily, the reality is that it really is restrictive. And then this third piece here, this is a map showing our recent work on accessory dwelling units. As Nell mentioned, we completely overhauled our ADU provisions as part of ReCode Phase 1. Prior to that, the rules around ADUs were inconsistent and they were zone-based. So from zone to zone, there were a different set of rules. There were different rules around unit size. There were different rules around the age of the structure in which that ADU could occur. There were rules around affordability. So certain zones, if you were to introduce an ADU, would have to put a deed restriction on the property to ensure that ADU would be maintained as an affordable unit. And what we found in anecdotally speaking with folks who were looking to develop ADUs was that it was, you know, on top of the fairly high cost to develop an ADU, that those processes were difficult to kind of navigate and work through it. And so that there really wasn't a lot of ADU development. And so these changes to ADU policies enabled any residential use across the city to have up to 2 new accessory dwelling units. These units could be either internal to the principal dwelling or attached or detached, which was a change. And then also exempted those accessory dwelling units from meeting density requirements and density requirements or parking requirements. So again, the goal here was to make this a much more streamlined process, much easier for people to navigate, to increase, kind of incrementally increase in these, you know, in areas across the city, the amount of density that we're seeing. All right, and then the next element here is around transit-oriented development. So again, this gets back to one of the prior recommendations, which was around reducing our parking supply, or kind of really shifting mindsets away from single occupancy vehicles. In order to do that, we need to ensure that people can easily access, you know, places of employment, amenities, housing opportunities, all within concise areas that are accessible to public transportation in order to make that shift away from single occupancy vehicles. And so that is one of the key recommendations in the land use code evaluation, is to really co-locate those various uses. And so this next set of graphs or maps, show a couple of key variables that are important to understand as we start to do this work and start to think through how a more well-used, or a transit system with higher ridership, for example, would effectively operate in the city. And so the first characteristic that is important to understand is population density. In order to support bus rapid transit, which is kind of the preferred mode of public transit that the city and the region is looking into as we look to expand our public transit options around Portland, is that in order to support that system, really you need 30 or more people per acre. And as you can see on this map, there are very few areas within the study area that really kind of meet that characteristic. So there are some areas on Peninsula with 30 or more residents per acre, but generally outside of the Peninsula, population densities drop fairly significantly. And so this is something where if we're looking to promote rapid transit, we then also need to start promoting new residential development in those areas where we're looking to actually achieve that rapid transit system. And then the next characteristic to consider is employment density. And again, not surprisingly, you can see here that employment density is much higher on the peninsula and then decreases as you move away from peninsula. And similar to population density, higher employment density is really important in order to have a successful transit system. So this is a map showing kind of the two preferred alternatives for what the city and the region is considering in terms of a rapid transit system. The first is along Brighton Avenue, which you can see going from downtown Portland out to Gorham. And then the second is along the existing rail corridor. A third element that helps contribute to a successful transit system is proximity of stops along a given route. And so really the kind of maximum spacing is typically around a mile. And so we're using this map to better understand, again, what the existing zoning is, how it relates to those population and employment density numbers, and then kind of mapping out where there are opportunities within these corridors to really either maintain what is there in terms of zoning and in terms of development patterns, or enhance what is there to promote a more robust rapid transit system. And so that's what this map is showing, given that characteristic. All right, and then the last recommendation, and thank you for bearing with me, I know this has been, this has been a lot to get through, is around complete neighborhoods. This in many ways is closely tied to the transit-oriented development discussion. The city's comprehensive plan has a goal that all Portland residents should have the option to live in a neighborhood where they can access all of the amenities that they would need in kind of their typical daily life, without ever needing to step foot into a car. And so that includes places where you can buy groceries, where you can access places of employment, where you can access open space and educational facilities and libraries and other kind of community amenities and gathering points. And having all of that within a kind of a concise walkable distance from where you live. And so one of the, this is kind of a central topic within the code evaluation, is how we can achieve complete neighborhoods across the city. As part of some earlier work that we did, we actually did this mapping exercise based around a number of key variables, including grocery store locations, schools, libraries, medical offices, public open space, coffee shops even, to understand really where across the city complete neighborhoods exist currently, and then where there are gaps. And so this map is starting to show across Portland what those, where those kind of defining characteristics exist, and then where we need to start thinking more critically around how we can introduce some of those elements into those locations. So this map is showing not only the complete neighborhoods map, but also our business, our neighborhood business zones, which we're looking to as kind of a tool to help introduce some of those uses across various areas of the city. It's a way to kind of fill in some of those gaps, if you will. All right, and with that, we are, this is our link for our email, as well as our website. And with that, we are happy to go ahead and answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt, Nell, and Christine. This is very informative. One thing, just in case people aren't quite sure, can you mention a little bit more about ADUs? What, in kind of layman's terms, what are ADUs?
Yeah, of course. So an accessory dwelling unit, the idea initially was to allow for multi-generational housing. So, and this is a housing type that goes back quite some time, where you could have a principal dwelling unit like a house, but then you could have an in-law suite, or someplace on your property where for example, a young professional, young professional could live, or where your parents could end up living. And this idea has really increased to allowing kind of more broadly to have a new housing unit or new dwelling unit in certain contexts, where it doesn't necessarily change the characteristics of a given neighborhood. So the idea here is to preserve the existing characteristics of a neighborhood. So if it's a single family neighborhood, it would still read as a single family neighborhood, but then you could kind of gradually or incrementally increase the actual amount of housing within that context without changing those characteristics.
Great, thank you. And get some questions are coming in, so we'll go to Bill. Why don't you go ahead and unmute Bill and
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Matt, that was awesome. I was really blown away. This is a great step forward to realizing one climate future. My only criticism is, I don't know how far these various strategies are going to take us to our final goal. If you look at, say, for instance, the transportation issue, creating those alleyways there, I thought that was really good. But we don't know, how much of a climate impact, how much of a CO2 footprint could that get us? Certainly some of these strategies are going to not necessarily be fulfilled, right? Some will be 50%, maybe some will only be 10% adopted. And according to the Portland Plan 2030, every decision that the city makes needs to look at CO2 emissions. And so I would suggest, ask, cajole that your analysis looks at, well, if 20% of this strategy is adopted, we get this far. If 50% of this strategy is adopted, we get 100% of our goal. That is really the motivating factor for me is how good is this based on what CO2 footprint will allow us. They're all going to be positive, but I don't know if it's going to get us to our OCF goal.
Well, I think that's a good comment, right? And I think One Climate Future did some of this work, right? We know that certain strategies coming out of One Climate Future make more of a dent in our CO2 emissions than others. And I think what we're, I think that it's a great point. I think what we're trying to do with the land use code is make a dent both on the mitigation side and on the resiliency side. And on the mitigation side, we know that not only are we trying to get people out of single occupancy vehicles, like Matt mentioned, right? Like we're trying to encourage a mode shift. We want people to be walking and biking and able to meet their needs within a walkable, bikeable distance, et cetera, or on transit. But we also need to build that EV infrastructure, right? Because we know people are going to continue to get around by car, and that's just going to happen. And so I think we know from looking at One Climate Future how those different recommendations sort of play out against each other in terms of putting a dent in our emissions, and time will sort of tell like how quickly the impact, how quickly we actually see the impact. And I think it's a good thing for us to be thinking about in terms of sort of priority. How do we get the biggest bang for our buck as fast as we can? But ultimately, it's going to take a little bit of a kitchen sink. We know that, right?
Right. But in order to determine what gets us the biggest bang, we need to figure out what that CO2 footprint is.
Yep.
So I don't know whether, I guess I sort of doubt that you guys were going to look into that. I could, appreciate that it could be a great effort, but why disturb a neighborhood if we don't know what it's going to save us? For instance, the retirement of old efficient buildings needs to be just as important as putting up new buildings that are energy efficient. So I'm not sure how that's, falling into your plan. But I generally have that comment all the time. Troy knows that.
Yeah, no, and again, it gets to sort of how we prioritize different recommendations. And again, I think we're using One Climate Future and the sort of guidance that it gave us around modeling future greenhouse gas reductions as a guide in this work. So it's a good point.
Looks like Russell has his hand up.
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you for that. As a former community planner myself, I can see you've done a lot of work and raised a lot of questions for me, mostly positive. But I think my main concern maybe is now how are you going to, zoning's a crude tool, right? I mean, even though we're refining it as we're moving forward, it's a tough tool to manage the market with. And kind of following on Bill's comments a little bit, this session, the overriding goal is to try to coordinate the land use code with climate goals and emission reductions and so forth. And I see a lot of the good elements in there, incentivizing, sustainable development, and the transportation piece is obviously critical. But I'm a little concerned, and maybe you guys have thought about this, hopefully, on how you balance that moving forward. I know there's a lot of pressure on the city to do more about affordable housing, and that's another whole piece. And you've integrated in the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. My feeling is, and I used to work on Cape Cod for years, where housing is always, the housing crisis was, we had the same crisis in 1980 that Portland's looking at right now. But the market's going to take off way before. My feeling is the market's going to take advantage of those pieces way in advance of when you're going to be able to get the transportation piece in place. So it seems like the possibility exists for more traffic problems, especially since the ADUs, if I heard you right, have been exempt from additional parking requirements. And I think I get the notion there is that you want to kind of create that pain so they'll pivot towards mass transit, right? Is that what you're doing there by capping the parking? Have any given any thought to, or does the possibility exist for like satellite parking in the interim and the outer lying areas to take some of the pressure off the main arterials coming in? Because I see the ADU thing is taken off first. So that's kind of my first piece, and maybe I got a second question, but maybe I should let it go at that right now. Is that clear, or is that too vague? How are you going to balance these things? How are you going to try to, is there language in the ordinance for these various 7 components here to sort of incentivize some aspects first, hold back on others? You're going to try to do it all at once? You're going to try to let the market take care of it on its own? How do you implement?
Yeah, I'll jump in with a start to that. I don't know if I'll capture all of what you're asking. I think there's a lot bundled in there, but I will couch the particularly the ADU example and the no additional parking requirements in some of our other approaches to parking. And I think the city's approach, which has evolved over the years and has sort of ramped up in some ways. With phase 1, we made a lot of changes to parking requirements that allowed additional flexibility, allowed additional ability for exemptions, particularly near transit. But if that's kind of a continuation of an idea, I think, in Portland, which hasn't been, like some cities, it has not been an approach of we are going to set a maximum cap or we're going to prohibit parking, but to sort of take a lighter touch and let parking not be the barrier to infill development. And what we find with that approach is often as not, private property owners will try to get parking on their lot. It's an amenity for them too. But it is not going to be the decisive factor on whether that's valuable land on a small lot. And if that helps someone work out that a calculation that building in a small apartment is a good thing to do on that lot, then we're going to take that barrier away. We don't always see it used, but sometimes we do. So in that sense, it is kind of letting the market answer that question or find the right tenant for a lot like that. In some ways there'll be a self-selecting process, whether it is someone who doesn't drive as much, so it's not as big a deal, or someone who's making a calculation that they can get around another way. And so we are sort of taking a leap that some of those questions are okay to get worked out by property owners figuring out if this is a good investment. And it's a big investment to build a new housing unit, and people are going to think about it. So that's one part of the answer, but I think it does kind of ripple through other ways we've approached parking regs in the city. And you're right, there is a sort of a chicken egg question, but that transit's not going to be built before or sort of rise to meet a population that's not there. And at some point you do kind of have to move the question and create sort of a viable base for that transit to work, or not even just our transit to work, for it to be a viable base to open up a small shop near a neighborhood people can get to on foot, that sort of thing. So there is a kind of a circular question to pursue, but I think especially since we are talking about incremental change in these neighborhoods, I think it's important to remember that we're talking about more intensive development in those nodes, major corridors. We're not talking a crude brushstroke of the same treatment for every area of the city. And I think part of the subtlety of ReCode, we know what some of the issues are. Part of that subtlety is dialing it in a way that feels sort of tuned to different parts of the city in a way that makes sense. And the idea for neighborhoods is always that it's going to be a somewhat graduated approach. So you're not just seeing, oh, there's 3,000 more units just here in Nason's Corner. I don't think that's what we're expecting. That it's going to be a little bit more gradual rather than all coming all online at once, certainly on those residential pockets. So hope that helps.
Yeah, I know it's hard to gauge. My sense is that I actually have a real estate license too, so I'm involved in real estate now. But my sense is that, you know, when you incentivize the market to do certain things by relaxing codes a little bit, you know, the market leaps at that. And in some communities that I'm familiar with where they've relaxed the housing requirements, and you know, again, it is a balance. I'm kind of, you know, affordable housing is an issue. That's a great way to get at it. But when that happens, a lot of times what we've seen is those housing units then become marketed, unless there's deed restrictions, as you mentioned, to keep them affordable, they become commercial properties. So people, you know, brokers are evaluating short-term rentals not as rental units, I mean, not as housing units. They're like commercial properties. They're using income generation to set market value. Provincetown, Massachusetts is a great example. I mean, you look at one-bedroom apartments, condos, apartments, there for $1.5 million. You know, it's nuts. People can't even afford to live there anymore. So you know, that's one concern I have about that. My other question though was relating to the incentivizing the sustainable development. Is that going to ride over the others? Getting back to the climate goals, if the incentivizing of the density bonuses and the accessory dwelling units and, you know, the neighborhood hubs and stuff, if that's all climate sustainable, incentivized through your sustainable development piece with high efficiency, LEED certification or passive house, whatever it is, that would seem to make a lot of sense. So in other words, that would be a precondition. Is that a precondition to those at all, or are those wide open at this point? So your bonuses that you're giving, right? Are they going to have to meet the sustainability aspect first or not?
So we have not actually drafted language yet. We're still at the point of recommendations. So, but the way that a bonus generally works is, yes, if you meet certain conditions, then it unlocks a bonus in terms of additional height or additional density, et cetera. And so we're still sort of thinking about how that would work and where best it would work. And so, yeah, if you have feedback on that or how it could work, we'd love to hear.
Yeah,
And I'd add that part of that's going to be addressed through building and energy codes. So Portland currently is enforcing the IEC 2021,
Right.
which is the voluntary stretch code that the state established. But you know, the state statute requires that the stretch code always be stronger than the base code. So, but in 2024, the code will strengthen further. It will require even higher performing buildings.
Yeah. And so this would be a question of whether we want to go further than the stretch code, you know, incentivize people to go further than the stretch code right now.
We kind of related to that now. You kind of alluded to it a little bit in the presentation about one thing in One Climate Future, it talks about climate resilience overlay zones as a way to kind of address some of the situations maybe on the waterfront and other parts of the city. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about what would be a process, or what's the process for thinking about those?
Yeah, so coastal resiliency overlay, there was some work that was done as part of One Climate Future to sort of start down the path around thinking around how we would build the coastal resiliency overlay. And we did some work in our office on so initial thinking on a coastal resiliency overlay a couple of years ago. But there are a number of sort of steps in building a tool like that, right? There's sort of figuring out the geography. What are we actually talking about in terms of a physical space in which the overlay would apply? And then there's thinking about what are the standards that would apply within the overlay, right? So are there standards about particular uses? This is something that our consultant has flagged, right? Are there uses we just don't, that just shouldn't be in places that are going to experience regular inundation, right? So there's a use element or potentially a use element of an overlay in terms of what uses are permitted within an overlay. And then there's often in other places that have developed them a dimensional element as well, right? In places that are likely to get inundated, what's the finished floor elevation look like? What do heights look like to sort of compensate for what you need to gain in finished floor elevation? And then there would be performance standards as well, right? Like making sure that anything that's built in an area that is vulnerable is going to be able to withstand what we know is coming. And so there's a lot of work involved in developing an overlay like that. There are communities across the country that have done this work recently. And so there are lots of great examples, but there's technical work, there's outreach and public engagement that would need to happen around an overlay, a coastal resiliency overlay. And so that's a piece of work that we've identified as needing to happen. When we expect that it will happen probably under a sort of ancillary track. Some of the work may happen during ReCode phase 2, but we need to put some resources and time and energy into that initiative sort of on its own as well.
Great, thanks. Another question that kind of people ask me a lot of times is, we see development maybe on the waterfront or other parts of the city that are vulnerable and wonder like why, we have Plan 2030 and we have One Climate Future. Why are we letting them do that? So I think if we could maybe have some clarity, but what's the process for making it so that there are different rules there?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now we have, we have shoreland zoning ordinance, we have a floodplain ordinance. And so, projects that are, or development that is happening in low-lying areas, needs to play by the existing rules that we have set right now. And so, again, needs to build above the floodplain and need to deal with shoreline setbacks and wetlands rules, et cetera. But we do not, in our current existing land use code, have a resiliency overlay, for example, that says you need to plan for X feet of sea level rise on top of the existing floodplain. And so the standards that people are meeting now are the standards that exist within our code right now. This is part of the reason we're working on evolving the code to deal with climate change in a more comprehensive way. Was that clear enough?
It does. I think that, I think that does very well. And George has his hand up.
George, you have a question in the chat that I saw, which was about, this may not be the question you want to ask now, but I'll answer it now just in case. You asked about deadline on commenting on the code evaluation. And we plan to leave the code evaluation that Matt sort of summarized in part to you open on the ReCode website through the month of February and into March. So there's plenty of time to comment on it. We also will be releasing a survey that tries to gather public feedback or feedback from the public on it over the next week. And then we're planning an event in early March to gather feedback on the code evaluation as well. So the short answer is through the rest of the month and into March.
No, that's helpful. I just, it's a little clunky, the commenting system, you have to kind of laboriously enter comment, all your information for every single comment. So I haven't really waded into that, but I just wanted to know that, it's not, you're not going to shut it down Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock or something. It's not clear anywhere where that comment period of the duration is. So maybe you can flag that somehow for people just so they know that there's time left to do it. It's not a futile thing that, time is run out. But I had two quick things that I just wanted to focus on. One is, do we have any information yet on the accessory dwelling unit change in the ReCode phase 1? Has it actually produced any applications? I know COVID and, building and labor shortages right now are not helping, but I mean, we're about maybe 14 months into that code change. A lot of people were anticipating that code change was going to happen. Maybe they didn't know exactly what the council was going to pass in November of 2020, but it does seem like, it was anticipated. So a lot of people probably were kind of chomping at the bit. So I think that's important for us to understand that land use is very slow, and things like market, depressions and recessions and pandemics and all kinds of things inevitably are going to make it hard for people to do land use changes quickly because they take time. I mean, the laws of gravity apply among other laws, but so that is just important for us to know, because I think that if you're touting this as a big change, I think we also should acknowledge it's 5 to 10 years before we're probably going to see any real meaningful housing production, even citywide, never mind in particular places. The other question I wanted to ask was, the One Climate Future document, it's really big. I would say that most people haven't actually read it, but it's ambitious in its rhetoric and kind of its headlines, but it is really small ball when you actually look at most of the changes that are being talked about. And I think that what it lacks, and what maybe ReCode lacks right now, is a real vision of what we want our city to look like if we're serious about climate change. And for me, I don't think that anyone should be lulled into thinking that anything we do in Portland is going to move the ball on climate change. I mean, the US Census is a great example. We just had, the new census figures came out, and the United States grew in the last 10 years, equivalent to over 16 states of Maine in terms of the number of extra people we now have in the United States. Over 16 states of Maine worth of people. So whatever we do ourselves here is not really going to save the planet. But what I think we're doing is we're doing our part, like going back to like World War II, like, rationing and like, scrap metal drives, like everyone did their little part, and collectively we hopefully move the ball. But, it was all those little small individual actions, but we need to figure out, well, what is our little contribution here? And I think it goes back to World War II, where because of the war effort, we had this amazing bus network that literally happened overnight. I mean, the trolley system basically collapsed right before World War II, but the War Department basically encouraged, because all these people had to get in and out of the shipyard in South Portland, for the region to have this amazing bus network because of rationing and the fact that most people still could not afford cars because of the Depression and whatnot. We had literally hundreds of buses going in and out of Monument Square like every couple of hours. I mean, it was like an amazing thing. And it encouraged regional planning. People carpooled from like New Hampshire to like work at the shipyards. I mean, it was an amazing example of what we can do as a society if we want to do that. But it required trade-offs. Like people with single-use automobiles had to be punished. Literally, like people were prosecuted for violating the, gas rationing rules. And that's kind of what has to happen. If that's what we want to do as a society to make Portland denser and transportation friendly, like we need a vision of what that means. And it has to mean somebody has to give something up. And if we're not willing to admit that, then I feel like this is just sort of just good feeling. So, I mean, that's my view. So I wish you guys could establish a vision that people can actually understand. I don't think reducing, a building's energy cost for a major office building in downtown Portland by 11% over the next 12 years is a vision. That's small ball. So I just wish you guys had the ability to project something without having to wait for us to give you permission to do that. So thank you.
Well, thanks for the comment, George. Appreciate that. I think I agree. We need to have a bigger vision. I guess I would respectfully disagree that we don't have a bigger vision. There's definitely components that build to a larger whole, and we're talking about decarbonizing and electrifying the whole city. I'd say that's a large endeavor. that we're just now beginning to undertake. So there's a lot, there's a lot of pieces, and I totally take your point that it's going to take time,
Yeah.
especially in terms of changing land use patterns and how people develop things.
Yeah.
We aren't going to snap our fingers and recreate, the excellent public transportation that was in, throughout Maine, 60, 70 years ago. But
I will say though,
aspire.
I think on the transportation front, we're in a good moment, right? There is growing emphasis in this direction at a federal level and at the state level. And there's a lot of money to be used on transportation investments in the near future. And so, looking at that map that Matt threw up that showed potential rapid transit spacing along Brighton Avenue or along the Mountain Division, right? There's real possibility that there would be rapid transit along the Husky Line corridor. And that's an area of the city that isn't super dense right now, right? And so there's real opportunity to build something there. And again, we need to make sure that everybody's on board before we go there. But but there's an exciting opportunity to make a real shift in land use and transportation along a corridor like that, which is exciting. So, and on the ADU question, George, that you asked, we are working with permitting and inspections to track ADUs and to develop a report for 2021 to just look at what happened with ADUs in 2021. We're in the process of actually building that data now. And so we don't have it to report right here, right now, but look for it in the future, because I think you're not the only person asking that question by any means. And like you said, there's many variables in the equation, right? Construction costs are way up, and we're in the middle of a pandemic, et cetera. But certainly the policy was intended to try to spur additional ADU production. So
the only thing I'd add to that now is we're really interested in tracking ADU information too, and I think to George's point that these things can be slow. Sometimes they're fast, sometimes they're slow. And I think we're not going to see just hundreds of ADUs were built last year. I think it will be a sort of slow, gradual thing, particularly in the moment we're in. But the thing I wanted to add is that it won't be particularly compelling information yet from a trend line perspective, because we've got 1 year and the terms sort of apples to oranges comparing last year, the year before, I think, in terms of how we looked at that, because it's been 1 year on the books. So I think we're pulling that data together, and it will be valuable, but I think it will be even more valuable in 3 years, sort of see over time what's the impact of a change like that.
So we're a little over an hour, so I just want to maybe you can sum up and wrap up. So we know this is an ongoing process. You're still taking comment on the document that's posted currently on the recommendations. So if people want to follow along and participate, so they can do comments, and then I suspect at some point there'll be ordinance recommendations. So how do people follow along, and how do they stay involved in the process?
yes, so I'll quickly answer that question, then Winston will get your question as well.
Oh, sorry, Winston.
So the best place to find information about this process as it continues is at the ReCode website, which is ReCodePortland.me. And right now there you can find the code evaluation we've been talking about, including a video that sort of summarizes the recommendations, and a sort of shorter piece that sort of summarizes the recommendations if you don't have time to read the entire document. You can comment directly on the recommendations from the code evaluation in the document. That's what George was talking about. But we're also trying to provide other ways for people to provide feedback on the recommendations where they stand right now. So I mentioned a survey, which we're hoping to release in the next week. We're planning an event for early March where people will be able to speak, talk directly with others and with our consultant and with us about the code evaluation recommendations. And so a good way for people, in addition to just checking the ReCode website, you can sign up for on our email list on the ReCode website, and you'll be notified when additional opportunities to get involved emerge. So there will be, again, notices about that public forum in March, and notices about the survey, et cetera. So I would encourage everybody to visit the ReCode website, sign up for the mailing list. And then in terms of process after the code evaluation public engagement is done, The idea is to take public feedback on the code evaluation, feedback from the council and from the planning board, who also are meeting to talk about the code evaluation, and then to put together a strategy for actually drafting text amendments and map amendments, to the land use code. So that will look like red line versions of the dimensional standards or of the use standards or of our shoreland zoning, et cetera. And there will be a public process around those amendments. There'll also be a planning board and a council process around those amendments. And we anticipate that work to really start, later on in the year. We're talking about, summer and into the fall and beyond.
Great, that's really helpful. And then Winston, I apologize, I missed your hand up.
I'm sorry, I should have had it up a little sooner. I just have kind of two questions really quickly. I wonder, first of all, if there's a way that we can restrict short-term rental usage in certain areas through the land use code, because it seems like if you're allowing people to build 4-unit buildings or accessory dwelling units, because we need that population density so that we can have a public transportation system in a new neighborhood, it really is unhelpful if that's used for short-term rentals, because it changes the market in a really negative way. We're seeing that on the Hill here, where in the winter, entire houses are empty. And it's kind of creepy walking around in the middle of the week because there are just no people in some parts of the Hill. So I think there's too concentrated in this really dense neighborhood we have that would work really well, but I don't even know. There's 400 units allowed in the city, but I think they're really concentrated in the denser neighborhoods that we have, which is kind of damaging. That might be something you guys can't do, and you have to wait for the council to fix it. So I have that question. And the other question is, it seems to me like it's sort of self-evident looking through the document and looking at what we need to do with the need for density, that single family zoning, is there anywhere where that's appropriate? Because there's a lot of places right now where it restricts it to single family zoning. But that means that I make less than 40 grand a year, so I can't live there. People like me can't live there, and it's very inefficient when you look at the space usage. We have so little space in this city. So I don't know if there's anywhere that it really makes sense to continue to do it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I'll jump in there. Thanks for those. The one thing I'll say about short-term rentals, first, sort of, just to sort of, is it ReCode? Is it something else? Short-term rentals are not handled in this part of the code. It lives somewhere else. It's an important topic. As you pointed out, there are limits on short-term rentals now, but where they're concentrating, that's really interesting. That would be really interesting to do an analysis of where those are. So it's an important topic with some implications, I think, for our housing stock of how do we strike the right balance on short-term rentals, but we're not doing it in this. And I don't think it's purely an ADU issue. I think it often comes up as a question when we talk about ADUs and things like that. Not that you said it was purely an ADUs, but we often get them together as far as what it brings to mind for folks, which is interesting too. But so interesting, we're not going to tackle it in ReCode, but certainly worth talking about how those things intersect. I wanted to pause on the multifamily, single family question, because I think it's such a lot of people are talking about it. It's a super important issue, but I almost think it is a flag that we need to scrutinize our code, in the sense that it is not the only thing that determines how dense our neighborhoods are. It's one that's very much sort of on people's minds right now, and certainly in planning circles. You could have a community that doesn't allow single family anywhere, but has huge lot sizes, minimum lot sizes, not nearly as effective as single family homes, perhaps with some ADUs on small lots as far as walkable neighborhood goes, and access to transit and things like that. And so I think that just gets into some of the subtlety. It's one of the things we're looking at. It's not the only, and I think there are other dimensional requirements to think about. How do those things all fit together? Whether we should sort of not allow any zones to allow single family zoning and not multifamily zoning, it's a good question. One thought I have is we do want a diversity of housing types. It's okay to have single family homes in a city. It's a question of, are we letting other things in and where are we letting other things in? So I think that will be something that comes out of this. We don't think that every residential neighborhood should be of the same density as, say, downtown, but what is that right balance? What's the right dimensional balance? I would point out right now, we allow 2 ADUs on every lot. So even a single family home could potentially have 2 additional apartments. I think by some sort of basic litmus, we're already doing that. It's a question of where are they going to get built and when are they going to get built? And then, so that's not a crisp answer. Are they appropriate anywhere? We're going to look at what is the right thing for this currently low density neighborhood